Hey guys, I just wanted to give a brief introduction before this video. This is my new series, Southern Scientists. In it, I'm going to be bringing in several people that deal with science on a daily basis, specifically from the South. We're going to talk about several different topics, give it sort of general interview, podcast-y type experience, and I really hope you guys enjoy. Give it a second so I know where to clip it. Hi guys, it's Ethan with Southern Science here, and today I'm with Billy Don Loper, and we're going to talk about anthropology. So Billy, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm Billy Loper. I am currently getting my master's degree in U.S. history from the University of Southern Mississippi. I specialize in Mississippi cultural history, and right now I'm finishing up my master's thesis, which is on the cultural memory of Civil War era descent in Mississippi Civil War memory. So yeah, I have a bachelor's degree from USM in history with a minor in cultural anthropology and archaeology. So.
All right, see that's interesting. What I really want to talk about here, when you say anthropology, the very first thing I go to as a biologist is, oh, you're talking about evolution. But I know you think of it very differently as a historian. So what would you say anthropology is?
Yeah, so you kind of have three different scientific studies that are all three sort of, I guess what you would call soft sciences, that have to do with different aspects of humanity. Because anthropology broadly is the study of humanity, but you have psychology, and that's the study of the human psyche. You have sociology, which is sort of the study of human social constructs and social systems. And then anthropology is really the study of human advancement and culture. So it absolutely is sort of biology, biological evolution, and human advancement, primatology, but it's also study human culture. Archaeology is a big part of anthropology, which is the study of past human civilizations, past human culture through physical, architectural, and artifact remains. But the big thing about all of this is it's all very interdisciplinary. You'll have an anthropologist who uses some psychological evaluation, who does a little bit of archaeology, a little bit of primatology, and a little bit of sort of sociological evaluation.
So it's an umbrella term.
Yeah.
It's got a whole lot of different subsections. Like biology, you don't just have biology. You have zoology, you have botany, you have mycology, stuff like that. It's not just one thing.
Absolutely. You have cultural anthropology, you have economic anthropology, archaeology, primatology, evolutionary anthropology, all sorts of different things.
All right, would it be safe to say as a historian you use cultural anthropology more than, say, evolutionary biology?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't make a lot of, as part of my education in anthropology, I took a biological archaeology class, which was not the study of, when you think archaeology, you think, physical artifacts.
Yeah. Arrowheads, whips and hats and rolling boulders.
But biological archaeology was human remains, specifically human remains.
Forensics almost.
Yeah, it's very similar to sort of forensic archaeology, and a lot of times forensics makes a lot of use of anthropological stuff as well. But I'm mostly use cultural anthropology because in a lot of ways, history, there has to be a dividing line, and depending who you talk to, that line stops at different points, where something stops being history and starts being current events, whether you consider that to be the 1990s or just a decade ago. Most people, I think, today would say about 1990 you start getting into current events.
And that's a generational thing too. Like we're roughly the same age group. For us, history stops at like the 90s because that's where we came into the picture. But for say a young Gen Z who was born like 2008, maybe that's a push forward a little bit.
Yeah, right. Because 1990 was over 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
So
it's 30 years ago.
It's 30 years ago, and it's definitely history, but when you start getting into the late 90s, and because history kind of works in sort of decades, kind of think of history in decades of.
We got some technical. Okay, there we go.
So and then you can cut this together. Yeah. History kind of works in decades where you're not going to look at 1999 and say that's current events, but look at 1990 and say that that's history.
Right.
It all has to kind of stick together. Where history stops, cultural anthropology and sociology pick up. And there's a lot of interdisciplinary work there. The research I do is definitely, history. Really, my thesis stops in the late 70s. But my personal interest, it goes well into that. And I'm especially very interested in a lot of economic anthropology, which is sort of class systems and the way different cultures use different economic systems.
My computer has decided that it doesn't like the idea of a podcast, so please ignore any beeping you hear. All right. Well, if anthropology, cultural anthropology is more modern events and histories, we got that cutoff date we talked about. When we hit that cutoff date, do we have to start looking at things differently and analyzing them differently, or do we all analyze it the same way?
I think it depends, because the big thing that makes cultural anthropology different is you can go sit down with people who have very recent memory who went through those events, because you could go sit down with somebody now that has a living memory of the Depression,
right?
But that's a living memory. If you're talking about, and this cultural history and cultural anthropology interact a lot, but COVID-19, if you want to go sit down and talk to somebody about how COVID-19 has affected their life, that's cultural anthropology. That's anthropology. It's not a living, it's a very recent memory. It is not a sort of diffused memory. It's very fresh in their minds. It's, in a lot of ways, it's still ongoing. You do start to approach things differently because first of all, it's a much more sensitive topic.
Right.
You have people, a large number of people, not just a few, who are alive in their prime who went through this event. They're going to have a very different reaction. And you have to treat that with almost a different sort of approach, a different level of respect. And the results you're going to come to are very different. A lot of times cultural anthropology, and this is definitely the big dividing factor, is an observational sort of style of research. If I was interested in seeing how farmers in the Mississippi Delta lived, I would go live with farmers in the Mississippi Delta for a few months. Can't really do that with Civil War soldiers.
That's what I think is very interesting, because with history, you can't really interact with it. It's happened, it's over, it's done. But when you go into modern events, when you study them, you're interacting with them, and that can change how they work.
Right.
Like the old saying, observing the experiment changes the outcome. That's talking about photons of light, obviously, but it kind of applies here, too.
It does. And non-intrusive observational techniques is a big part of anthropological training. And that's actually a part of anthropological training that I don't necessarily have the broadest amount of experience in. Because I didn't double major in anthropology, because if I would have had to do a capstone project where I would have went and done some observation like that. But so I know the theory behind it, but it's not something I've got a lot of experience in. All
right. That kind of leads to my next question. As a historian, how do you use anthropology?
So I definitely use it in a lot of ways, as far as especially my research gathering. I use a lot of oral histories, and that's a very sort of non-obtrusive observational technique, tangential thing. But also thinking about culture in an anthropological way, as it being non-ethnocentric, no one culture better than the other kind of idea, and looking at it as a idea of many different ideas. So your economic position influences your culture, your race influences your culture, your regional upbringing influences your culture, but so does the TV that you consume, and so does the music that you listen to, and that's all part of the same interacting system. And because I'm very interested in popular culture and popular media, that's been a lot of influence in that. The current research I'm finishing up, I've looked at a lot of Western TV programs from the late 20th century, and thinking about that in an anthropological way has helped me broaden that research.
And that's certainly something that's interesting. Never before in human society have we had an age where cultures clash like this, because it used to be the people you interacted with were all your culture. Primarily, without talking about wars or great migrations or anything. If you wanted to meet someone from a different culture, you have to go to where their culture is.
Right.
That's not the case anymore with mass information and the media and just the ability to look at things right at your fingertips.
Right. Globalization's been going on since, 1,000 years ago. It's been going on forever. the great empires of England and everything, and pioneered that. And especially it's been going on in America since really the Spanish-American War, when we started getting more involved in global politics. But globalization means a very different thing now, because not only do you have economic and political globalization, because world governments have always interacted. That's very different. That's a very broad sociological construct, sort of world systems analysis stuff. But as a culture, sitting in your living room in Seminary, Mississippi, you can interact with someone from, Saudi Arabia.
Right.
It's very, very different. And, a lot of the friction that you see comes from that. It's been a very rapid change. I mean, since the mid 90s, it's, even though to a lot of people that's history, that's very recent in the grand scheme of things. So it's been very rapid and very powerful change.
Right. So obviously you interact with anthropology a fair amount in your career field. How can someone like me, who had to literally Google what anthropology was before this session, how do we interact with it daily?
So anthropology is interesting in the fact that it is a very academic field that in a lot of ways can be very approachable. A lot of people probably interact with anthropology a lot more than they think they do, especially if they consume any kind of sort of National Geographic public broadcasting information. A lot of that's going to very much fall into your anthropological umbrella. And probably the best way that people can interact with it is to think about things in a culturally relativist manner. Sort of that's a major construct of anthropology, is sort of cultural relativism and fighting against ethnocentrism. Is whenever you interact with someone, especially in this new online global society, interact with them, try to conceptualize their culture and how that's influencing their decisions. And that sort of can begin this sort of process of anthropological introspection. And another way is, if you're interested in this kind of thing, if you're interested in other cultures, and when you read about them, that's interacting with anthropology, but also the academic literature on this kind of stuff. Like if you're interested in what it was like to live in Naples, Italy in the 1980s during the AIDS epidemic, that information's out there. There are books about that, and the nature of cultural anthropology and how it's sort of a first-hand account makes it very readable. So if anybody who's interested in it, just seek it out at your local public library, and it can help you better understand your culture and where other cultures are coming from.
So it's one of those unique scenarios where you learn more about yourself by observing something that's foreign to you.
You can start to better, as you understand how other cultures start to construct themselves, you start to understand how your own culture constructs itself.
All right, well, let's turn things a little bit more to our own central geography here. This show is primarily dealing with Southern specialists in events in science and all this wonderful stuff happening in the Southern United States. How does anthropology play a role in Southern society?
Yeah, so in sort of a national, in America, every region kind of has its own personality. Northeasterners have a certain way that they behave. Midwesterners have a certain way that they behave. People in the far west have a certain way they behave. Texans are their own kind of entire world. But the South, specifically the upper and deep South, not really your border states, your Missouri and Texas, again, is kind of its own world. But the Southeast, from Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, because of the Civil War, have always kind of been their own sort of insular society. And especially in the 50s and 60s, at the height of segregation, that was true as well. And that really started to change in the 70s and as things started to shift. But I say all that to say, if anywhere in the United States has been most affected by globalization, it's been the South. Because suddenly you have a culture of white Southerners who were very much sort of introspective into themselves, being forced to interact with people of all different ethnicities and races and sort of ideologies. And as it does anywhere, that creates a lot of friction. Through a sort of just anthropological approach and sort of attempting to not necessarily educate yourself, because not everybody has time to become a overnight anthropological expert, right? But if you attempt to think about things in a context of culture, how an individual culture is constructing itself and not necessarily how it's attacking you, that can help you better understand where that friction comes from, and I think will overall sort of help Southern society adjust in a continually sort of nationally diverse landscape. Because Mississippi, Alabama too, Louisiana too, but Mississippi, just speaking from my own expertise, had a very special, very unique culture up until 30, 40 years ago. And that sort of is a double-edged sword, because not only does that mean that Mississippi society is becoming more diverse, which is a good thing, it also means that part of it loses that uniqueness. And part of losing some of that uniqueness, like segregation and overt systemic racism.
Uniqueness does not mean value.
Right. But you also start losing Southern traditions, like traditional Southern folk music. You don't have that many people that know how to play traditional Southern folk music in the South or in Mississippi. You don't have that, and I'm speaking mostly of young people, because that's kind of who's carrying that. Of course, there'll be some 60-year-old fiddle specialist or something in the play hills. Right. But you don't have a lot of young people being interested in that. You don't have a lot of young people who are sort of taught how to craft a Southern quilt, because of our climate. We make quilts in a very different kind of way than like the Midwest and the Northeast does. So you don't have a lot of people learning how to do that. Southern cooking is starting to change. I never thought that I would go to a Southern restaurant and them have like Korean barbecue. It's starting to change. But by recognizing the way a culture is constructed, and other cultures is constructed in the way that it has inherent value, Mississippians or Southerners in general will also start to recognize the inherent value in the positive aspects of their own culture and start to work towards, the preservation of that. And that's a fine line to cross, because, places like Mississippi have a lot of economic and geographic problems, whereas to a lot of people, preserving particular parts of history and heritage may not seem like the most important things until they're gone.
Right. That actually brings up my next topic. Well, Mississippi's having a mass exodus of young people. Culturally, what's the founding behind that? Is this a natural progression, or is it something that just sort of magically happened out of nowhere?
Well, that's sort of, and this is definitely speaking from personal experience and sort of my own cultural understanding of the state, not so much supported by any historical trends.
As a native who has a lens into this.
Although you could definitely probably draw some similarities between the mass exodus of young people and the mass exodus of African Americans during the Great Migration. There's not a lot of economic opportunity in Mississippi. Mississippi has the lowest cost of living, also the lowest per capita income. Which those things definitely kind of balance themselves out. We're in about as bad or good shape as anywhere else in the country, just depending on how you look at it. But Mississippi's sort of traditionally insular society. Mississippians still don't very much like outsiders. We don't like people coming down from other places and kind of telling us what to do, and I'm definitely guilty of that myself. But that insular culture, and especially its resistance, its inherent resistance, just from the way Mississippi society was founded, towards other groups, sort of, whether that be minority groups or sort of gender diversity groups, creates a friction that drives sort of globally minded young people out of the state. And that sort of pairs with the fact that, maybe some people would stay if there was economic opportunity, but unless you are a day laborer or sort of, in the traditional business space, there's not a lot of economic opportunity in the state of Mississippi. If you're a welder or you want to work offshore, there's a lot of economic opportunity in the state of Mississippi. But if you want to be a historian, there's not a whole lot.
Well, going into the future, how do you think this exodus is going to affect Mississippi culture?
Well, it's been going on really probably since the 80s and the 90s. It's just sort of a part of teenage angst. I don't know how many of these young people that have left in the past, sort of the generation prior to me, have come back. How many end up coming back, or how many of the ones that are currently leaving or attempting to leave will come back. It's difficult to say how it'll affect Mississippi, except for the fact that without a young mindset, without a young workforce, you're going to have issues of stagnation.
Right.
The state government's going to stagnate because you don't have younger people running for state representative or state senate. You don't have younger people getting involved on a bureaucratic level or getting involved in the education system or getting involved in even starting businesses in the state of Mississippi. It's going to lead, and has in a lot of ways already led to, some stagnation. However, that is a issue of sort of state direction,
right,
and something that I can't say whether will ever get fixed or is on the way to being fixed, and only time will tell.
All right, well, let's talk about the elephant in the room here, COVID-19. It's shaken every aspect of American society, be it academics, culture, everything to its core. How do you think it specifically affected Southern culture?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, and this is something that sort of happened on a lot of different levels in the past 10 years or so, kind of increased a division within Southern culture between those sort of broader-minded individuals who are a lot of times part of that mass exodus process, and more, I don't want to say traditional because that implies that tradition is back, more stagnantly minded, more stationary,
more stoutly minded.
Yeah, more sort of insular individuals. The issue between how to manage COVID-19 and how much restriction is the correct amount of restriction, and wear a mask, don't wear a mask, that has created that friction that sort of broadened that gap of mass exodus. However, Mississippi is also an incredibly stubborn place. There are a lot of peoples, and this will probably be true in a lot of places. There are a lot of people who will tell you, it'll be 10 years before things go back to normal. Mississippi sort of refused to ever leave normal.
Yeah, I'm about to say, other than gas prices and the masks and like the obvious state shutdown we had for about 4 weeks or so, it's been...
and take that good or bad, however you personally want to take it. Whereas someone somewhere in Southern California, probably more specifically speaking, Los Angeles, it may be 10 years or 5 years before people start hugging in public again and start shaking hands. Mississippi never stopped doing that. Mississippi history, for better, Mississippi culture, for better or worse, historically has always been resistant to change. And, obviously, Civil War, that caused problems. And something like this, I think probably the best example is, and this goes for Louisiana, this is probably broader to the deep south than just Mississippi.
The big three, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, maybe like parts of Kentucky.
When Hurricane Katrina decimated the Gulf Coast, there was no normal, but we certainly acted like there was.
Right.
And that sort of, although this time with COVID-19, you didn't really see that sort of universal, even though it's definitely probably an environmental disaster on a similar level, it definitely took more lives in Mississippi than Katrina did. You didn't see that sort of broad and all-encompassing community embracement of, sort of going a new direction. I think you will see that broad sort of return to normalcy, especially as vaccinations increase. Can guarantee you there'll be some 4th of July celebrations this year.
Oh, yeah. What did Biden say? A small family barbecue?
Yeah.
I've had countless family barbecues in Mississippi since the pandemic started. We kind of just... We accepted that the pandemic was happening. We accepted that was a threat, and then we promptly ignored it.
Right, Right, and you can argue for wrong or right.
Yeah, I'm not
but
giving political stance here or anything. I'm just saying that's how we reacted. That's
Mississippians
Mississippi.
are very insular, but that also means that they value family over anything else. And it sort of sounds, it's not maybe not necessarily they value family because, to someone somewhere else that may sound like, well, then you should have been separating things like that. But
that connection,
it's the family interactions that are very important in Mississippi because of how so much of it is sort of agriculturally based, farming based, and how that sort of community grew up. So Southern culture, Southern society in general, is going to have to make a reckoning between preserving that very personal and very emotional culture, and this is definitely in the wake of COVID-19 is what's going to lead to this. They're going to have to reckon with that difference between that emotional and sort of very personal culture and that natural fear of change.
Right.
Probably the biggest thing that globalization, especially online globalization, has done is you can't be resistant to change for too long anymore.
Well, I know it certainly led to a more health-conscious society, for better or worse. As someone that's worked in hospitals, specifically in coronavirus wards, everyone seems to be an expert about it.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what type of masks to wear. Everyone knows what this means, what that means. We had a little bit of this. Well, I say a little bit, but there's a fair amount of this before coronavirus with like WebMD and stuff coming out and giving out not necessarily false information, just information that was interpreted in the wrong way.
Right.
Do you think, as I was saying, for better or worse, we are a more health conscious society. Do you think that culturally we will be more prone to keeping healthcare at the forefront of our minds, or do you think it'll slip back to how we were pre-COVID?
That's a good question. I don't know that I know the answer to that, even specifically in the South or in Mississippi, because there's definitely a trend to kind of go, well, that was horrible. Never going to talk about that again. But that's certainly, when you look at Katrina, when Katrina rocked the Gulf Coast, it definitely made its way up to
I lost my home in Katrina.
So the broader speaking Gulf South, I guess, there's those states. People are definitely a little bit more conscious of hurricanes now, but they're also it also creates a feeling of, that ain't nothing to be worried about. I made it through Katrina.
Yes.
And the same things definitely happened as sort of our global weather climate has changed. And the tornado alley has kind of descended into the South with Louisiana, Mississippi, and definitely Alabama. We have a period, South Mississippi, it used to be, and I very vividly remember this growing up, it used to be where winter ended in probably, February or so. And then you had a very short period of it being kind of cool, and then all of a sudden it got hot. Where now we have a much longer period of it being cool, really from March into early May. But that period is also very, very, very hazardous for tornadoes. I don't know if that's that I've become more conscious because they've gotten closer to home, or if that is that there's definitely more tornadoes coming through. But if it's actually that much more frequent, I don't know the numbers on it. That has created a very, very conscious culture of, checking the weather and watching that. Because I was never a weather watcher until, the past couple of years. It's become a little bit. It may just be that I'm getting older, but I don't know which way that's going to go. If after COVID-19, people are going to be a lot more conscious of, okay, the swine flu is coming through, everybody get out your masks and let's break them out, wash them, and get them ready. I highly doubt that'll happen because a lot of people didn't wear the masks to begin with. Or if it's just going to be that the next time something comes through, next year.
We've been through coronavirus. We don't have to worry about this.
Right. This summer when there's a West Nile outbreak, we'll say, we made it through 2020. We're not worried about it. So it'll be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see. So
thank you for talking with me, Billy, and thank you guys for watching. Okay.
All right.
That was pretty good. Yeah.